Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to dive into, well, it's a pretty heavy one, to be honest. We're talking about the David family. Specifically, the murder-suicide that happened back in 1978 in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, a really complex and frankly tragic event.
Absolutely. And to really get a handle on this, we've pulled together a whole bunch of sources. We've got news articles from back in the day,
Great.
Time, the New York Times, some local papers too, like the Deseret News, Salt Lake Tribune. Oh, and even the Washington Post.
And to get a little more depth, we're also looking at some academic stuff. There's a book that focuses on women who've committed, mass murder, and then a really interesting article from a homicide studies journal.
Right. The idea here is we don't just want to rehash the facts. Everybody knows the basics. We want to try and understand the why, the motivation behind this whole thing.
Exactly, because this case really went beyond Salt Lake City. It captured national attention. I mean, you had Rachel David, the mother, and 7 of her kids dying after falling from, like, the 11th floor of a hotel.
11 floors? It's just, I can't even imagine.
And just 3 days after that, her husband, Emmanuel David, he commits suicide too. So there's so much to unpack here.
Okay, so let's start with that day. August 3rd, 1978. What exactly happened at that hotel?
Well, the hotel was called the International Dunes Hotel back then. Kind of a crazy detail, but it's a Holiday Inn now.
Wow. I mean, that's a lot to process.
It really is. But yeah, Rachel David was there with her kids. And she didn't just fall, she pushed some of them from that 11th floor.
Push them.
That's what the reports indicate, yeah. And some of the older kids, at least 3 of them, they jumped too. It's like, how do you even begin to wrap your head around that?
It's just horrifying. 8 deaths in total, including Rachel herself. But there was one survivor.
Right. One of the daughters, 15 years old, she lived. But she was seriously injured, spent a whole year in the hospital. Her story is a huge part of this too.
It's easy to forget about the individuals when you're talking about something this big.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, this wasn't even the first suicide in the family. Just 3 days before, her husband, Emmanuel David, he takes his own life.
Right, right. In Emigration Canyon. So this wasn't just some random family tragedy, was it? There's more to it.
You're hitting the nail on the head. Emmanuel David, he wasn't just some regular guy. He believed he was like a divine leader, a prophet.
A prophet. Okay. Okay, so we're talking serious religious convictions here.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This wasn't just some casual belief. It was the core of who he was. And it shaped his family, his followers, everything. And it played a big role in what happened.
And didn't I read somewhere that he was also under investigation at the time?
Yeah, this is where it gets even more complicated. The Deseret News and a couple of other sources mention it. Emmanuel David, at the time of his death, was being investigated by the FBI for federal wire fraud.
So a self-proclaimed prophet who's potentially facing serious legal trouble. How does that factor into all this?
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle. I mean, think about it. You're claiming divine authority, and then bam, you're facing a federal investigation. The pressure must have been immense.
I can only imagine.
Right. Not only for him, but for his family, his followers. The whole thing could have just crumbled around him. And, some of the articles speculate that the fear of being exposed, of losing everything, it might have pushed him to suicide. And then, tragically, his family followed.
Okay, so let's try to connect all of this to the murder-suicide. The family's beliefs, their religion, it seems like that's the key, right?
Absolutely. The sources, especially that academic book we talked about, they all point to the idea that Rachel and those kids who jumped, they did it because they believed they were following Emmanuel to the next life.
So they weren't trying to escape a bad situation. They thought they were going somewhere better.
That's the idea. That homicide studies article, it even uses words like loyalty and altruism to explain their actions. It's a powerful concept, right? Death isn't the end, it's a transition. And their faith in Emmanuel, it was so strong that it basically overrode everything else. Their instinct to survive, everything.
It makes you wonder, how deep does a belief have to be for someone to do something like that?
It's a question that really gets to the heart of this whole tragedy. But it wasn't just about faith, was it? There were hints that the family might have been struggling financially too.
Right. One of the sources mentioned that. So maybe it was a combination of things. The religious beliefs, the fear, the pressure.
Absolutely. Money problems, especially on top of everything else, can make people feel trapped, desperate.
And when you've got someone like Emmanuel, this charismatic leader, telling you that there's another way, a better life waiting.
It's easy to see how people could be drawn in. So yeah, even though the sources don't give us a complete picture of their finances, it definitely adds another layer to the story.
Okay, so let's talk a bit more about Emmanuel David. We know he wasn't always Emmanuel David, right? His real name was Charles Bruce Longo.
Right, and he changed it sometime before 1970. But what's really interesting is his background with the LDS Church.
The Mormon Church.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He first got involved with them while he was in the U.S. Army. And get this, he even served as a missionary in Uruguay.
A missionary, so he was deeply involved with the church at one point.
Oh, yeah. And that's not all. He met his wife, Rachel, while they were both students at BYU, Brigham Young University.
A major Mormon university, so they are both very much a part of that world.
Exactly. And then, in June 1969, he gets excommunicated.
Excommunicated, wow, what happened there?
The sources don't go into detail about the exact reasons, but it's obviously a huge turning point.
I bet.
It suggests that he started to deviate from the mainstream Mormon teachings. Maybe he started developing his own ideas, his own interpretations.
And that led him to create the family of David.
Exactly. He breaks away from the established church and starts his own group where he's the ultimate authority. You know, it's almost like getting rejected by the church made his beliefs even stronger, more extreme.
It's a pretty classic story, isn't it? Someone gets pushed out, and they start their own thing, gather followers who believe in them completely.
And that's what's so fascinating about Emmanuel David. He went from a regular guy to a prophet leading his own group. It just shows how powerful a charismatic leader can be.
And how dangerous. Because it didn't end with the deaths at the hotel, did it?
No, it didn't. And this is one of the things that really stuck with me. Even after everything that happened, some of Emmanuel David's followers, they still believed in him. They actually thought he would come back.
They were waiting for his return.
Yeah, even as late as the year 2000, there were reports of people who still believed. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It's like they couldn't accept what had happened.
I know. And then you have the daughter who survived. It's heartbreaking. Reports from 1993 and 2000, they mentioned that she was in a wheelchair because of the fall and that she had tried to take her own life multiple times.
It's just tragic. She survived the fall, but she's still living with the consequences of everything that happened.
Exactly. She's a powerful reminder of the lasting impact of this whole tragedy. The physical scars, the emotional scars, the enduring power of her father's influence.
So to wrap things up, we've looked at this awful event, the murder-suicide, Emmanuel David's suicide, the family's beliefs, the financial pressure they might have been facing, and the aftermath, especially what happened to the surviving daughter. It's just a lot to process.
It is, and it raises some really big questions. How do people become so devoted to a leader, even when things go so terribly wrong? What makes someone vulnerable to this kind of influence? It's about the power of belief, for sure, but it's also about desperation, about the need for something to hold on to, even when it's dangerous.
And that's what we want you, the listeners, to think about. What does this tragedy tell us about the nature of belief, about charismatic leaders, about the fine line between faith and fanaticism? It's a question that stays with you long after you hear the details of the case.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even the most extreme beliefs can start in ordinary places. And it's a cautionary tale about the potential for tragedy when those beliefs become absolute.
Thanks for joining us for this incredibly tough but important deep dive. We'll see you next time.